Hi, and welcome to my channel, Laura's Library Card. So it is time for another Recent Reads video. Let's see how we're doing. So I'm going to just dive right in, and you can check out timestamps down in the description. The first book I'm going to talk about is A Place for Us by Fatima, Farheen, Mirza. I did do a individual review video on this, so I will link it up in the cards and down in the description. But the description synopsis for this book is that it is a literary fiction novel. We are following a Indian American Muslim family throughout the 90s and into early 2000s. They're living in California. We have multiple alternating points of view, and we see some major family events happening from the eyes of the children, the eyes of the parents, and over the course of the book, we explore how culture, community, gender, and expectations kind of influence people's actions and how they treat their family members and other people that they love. I really enjoyed this story. I had not really gone into it with high expectations. It was a book club book, and I was not in the mood for literary fiction, so I was kind of like, but it turned out I really enjoyed it. And I think that the book club discussion that we had also elevated my opinion. I felt like the writing was lovely, and it was really well layered to show the complexity of all the characters in this family. It made them all pretty well rounded. There was a lot of exploration throughout the book of deeper topics, including like sibling and family dynamics and relationships, the sort of changing of the times, parents versus kid, traditionalism versus modern views, modern beliefs, modern behaviors, etc. There was discussions of culture and religion, gender differences, etc., etc. So yeah, I really enjoyed this book. Definitely check out my review video if you are interested. I especially identified with the firstborn, Mahadia, one of the main characters, and yeah, like I said, the book club element made it really great. And I thought it was kind of interesting because my old people in my book club identified more with the parents, and I identified more with the kids. So yeah, overall, quite enjoyed the book. The next book I'm going to talk about is Fire in Her Eyes by Ruby Dixon. I listened to this on audiobook, and it is the 7th book in the series, in the Fire, Blood, Dragon series. In this one, it is a gender swap situation from most of the other books in the series. We have a human male, Gabe, who is determined to help a dragon female who's been following him. And so he uses some advice from some of his male dragon friends to kind of like conquer her and end up mating Tiva, the main female character. But she is having trouble with the voices in her dragon form. I'm not going to explain it. It's book 7 in the series. And so over the course of this book, they are sort of on a journey and traveling to try to find answers to some of their problems. I was excited to see this from the different points of view. All the other books have been human females with male dragons, so I was excited to have that switched up for this book, but ultimately I didn't really care about that. There was an element of sort of dominance throughout this book. A lot of times it was dealt with in like a sexual sense, that just kind of was like weird for me. Like there was all this like heavy consent discussion at the start, which is obviously appropriate from Gabe's point of view, but then there was like so much time that the characters were spending confused and disconnected, which just made for sort of dumb tension, in my opinion, because it just felt so obvious that dominant, like a slightly more dominating and slightly more submissive dynamic is what was needed in this relationship, and that's why they were kind of struggling. So overall, despite these two characters being mentally linked to each other, I felt like there was too much of a dependence on a miscommunication tropes happening, and I sort of felt like Tiva the dragon like felt less devoted to Gabe than some of the other counterparts of male dragons to their human females. So I wanted just a little bit better chemistry between these characters and some tighter writing in this installment of the series. The next title I'm going to talk about is a graphic novel. This is Strong Female Protagonist. The author is Brennan Mulligan, and the illustrator is Molly Knox Ostertag. I had the digital copy of this book. The premise is that Allison is our main character. She, that's her real name, and her alter ego is Mega Girl. She has actually stopped being a public superhero at the time of this book, and unfortunately is finding her civilian life difficult and is frequently being sucked back into the superhero job that she left. And this is interrupting her college education and her life. And throughout the course of this book, she is contemplating a lot of life decisions and trying to figure out who she is and what her goals are in her life and how being a superhero with powers might be useful or not. There were definitely a lot of topics brought up throughout this book for consideration by the reader as well as Allison. There's a lot of the butterfly effect and how our choices affect our lives and the unfairness of life. And there was also some elements of how Americans view like making a difference. But overall, I was kind of a little unsure about what points the author was trying to make or what my takeaways really should be. I feel like a big one was how Allison is learning or realizing that just punching out the bad guy is not necessarily the best way to solve a problem or the only way to solve a problem. And she realizes over the course of this book that there is a lot of need for aid in areas including, poverty and domestic violence and energy crisis. So yeah, we had a pretty good discussion during book club. The actual format of the book has sort of a running commentary by the author to you in breaking the fourth wall as a sentence or two at the bottom of every page. And I personally found that entertaining and interesting, but a lot of people in book club really did not like that element and felt that it actually took them out of the book to the extent that even I think two of them had DNF the book for that reason. So yeah, I felt like we had a good discussion additionally about how superhero powers have both positive and negative consequences, and that was an element that was being explored throughout this book. So it does, in my opinion, not have a very good ending just because there is very clearly a second volume, and so this one doesn't really have an ending. It feels like you are just kind of left mid-sentence because the story continues in the second volume, but I have not read that yet. The next book that I'm going to talk about is For the Love of April French. This is by Penny Ames. I heard this recommendation from Cousin at her channel is Always Doing. I will leave a link up in the cards and down in the description. You should definitely check out her channel. She makes amazing content and she's extremely eloquent and well-spoken. The premise for this book is that April is our main female character. She is a trans woman who likes to be a submissive at a local kink club, and while she's there, she's frequently helping out the other regulars and the newbies, and it's obvious that she cares a lot about the people who are there, but she also has a lot of walls up around her heart and doesn't do relationships. Dennis is the main male character, and he is new to town and he is a dominant, and when he meets April, there are immediate sparks and he's immediately drawn to her and they have chemistry. So they agree to a sexual relationship and April is keeping a secret, and obviously this is a romance and develops into a romance. I'm not going to give away what that secret is, even though it's not like a huge secret. I read this book during a vacation, a cruise with my sister, and I really felt like I really enjoyed the story, but also the strength of this book, in my opinion, was the characters. April has this great depth and complexity. We get to see her flaws and her vulnerabilities just as much as her charming and sweet qualities. Dennis was really compelling and he was really caring. He cares so much about not only April, but the other relationships throughout the book with his family and best friends. And that just made him really dreamy. I felt like the book's format and structure itself, was very interesting because the first good chunk of the book is told with alternating points of view, pretty much from April and then Dennis and then back and forth. But then there's a middle chunk where you go 6 months in one person's point of view, and then the next part is the other person's point of view covering the same 6 month. So it took a little bit of adjusting, but I ended up really liking how we get to see into the minds of the characters that way. And it did not come across as too repetitive. I will say a few times the text gets a little info dumpy / instructional, mostly surrounding the trans topics and trans physicality kind of discussions, but also surrounding some of the discrimination that both characters have faced, because she as a trans woman and he as a black man have faced microaggressions throughout their lives. But I do think that that was pulled off pretty well, and ultimately both the characters like go to therapy and have good communication, so that balances out the fact that they have to explain so much things to each other sometimes. And overall, even though I can't really speak to fetish or kink life, for me personally, it seemed like those lifestyles were handled in a very respectful manner, and the spice was hot without being like graphic. So I would definitely describe this book as sweet and swoony, and there was definitely still spice. So totally recommend For the Love of April French. It was really great, and I love to see all the representation that was present throughout this book. Unfortunately, my next book is not so great. This is a nonfiction title called Talking to Strangers: What We Should Know About the People We Don't Know by Malcolm Gladwell. I listened to the audiobook for this text. This is a nonfiction title that is discussing the psychology behind how people interact with strangers, and sort of what Americans are conditioned to think and what our immediate inferences are, and also discusses topics of misdirection, distraction, lying, and how we are not so good at identifying those elements. Ultimately, I kind of hated this book, which is strong to say, especially since it's nonfiction, and I was not expecting to feel that way. I listened to the audiobook, and a pro was that this was narrated by the author, which I enjoy, and there was some music elements that I thought were kind of interesting, but also there was this sort of like immersive sound effects kind of situation, and that was just kind of distracting to me, that there was these like weird transition sounds, and like it just sort of sounded like ASMR kind of in the background, and I kept thinking like, what is that? And I was realizing that then it was my audiobook. And also there are inclusions in the audiobook of actual recordings of some of the interviews that the author is doing, which is cool, but also these were like so clearly something he was recording from like his pocket or from the table. So there's frequently this sort of a poor quality element to that clip, and I struggled to hear and understand what was going on. So I was annoyed with the audiobook structure, by reading it on audiobook format. Also, the structure of the book itself was annoying to me. I felt like a question would be posed about, how do we deal with strangers? And then there would be like 20 examples presented, and not really full examples. They would be like, well, here's in this scenario, and in this scenario, and in this scenario. And then finally, this whole chunk of the book would be summed up with like a one sentence takeaway big point. And then this happened 4 times, because there's basically only 4 points made throughout the course of this book. And so I had to wade through tons of examples and kind of hold a lot of that information in my head before you finally get to that point finally being made. Additionally, a lot of the examples being used are either peer-reviewed journal articles, laboratory conditioned studies, which may or may not have a ton of applicability to the real world, and also a lot of real life court cases that had a lot of media coverage. And I didn't care how a lot of those were being presented to me, the reader. I felt a little bit like the author was trying to defend Brock Turner and like help make you see a pedophile's point of view, or was sort of making excuses for racists. There was a lot of times where I was like, okay, you're making a point here, but you're not looking at the scope of the complexity of this court case or, social issue. And so not only was just like the structure not helpful, but I was not enjoying the examples and had a lot to say about those. But obviously you can't argue with an audiobook. So I would definitely encourage everybody who might be interested in reading this book to read the review that Read with Cindy left on Goodreads. I will link it down in the description. And actually, I'm thinking of doing a dramatic reading at the end of this video. So if you want to hear that, stick around, because I felt like that was a very well written review that summed up all my feelings quite well. I did read a couple volumes of The Water Dragon's Bride by Toma, but I am not going to discuss them here because it's kind of hard to discuss some volumes of manga in the middle of this series. So I might do a big, huge summary on my next recent reads when I kind of finish out the series. Let me know down in the comments if that's a video that you would like to see where I discuss me reading all 11 volumes of that series. But the last book that I'm going to discuss today is Real by Kennedy Ryan. I had the ebook of this book. So this premise is that Neva is our main female character. She is a Broadway understudy, and then she is sort of discovered by a big name film director, Cannon, who is the male main character. He offers her the lead role in a biopic film that he is working on getting started. And they are basically fighting their attraction to each other from day one, but manage to keep everything professional until midway through filming, 3/4 of the way through filming process, when they basically start to date. And this becomes Hollywood gossip and scandal because it's a lead actress with the film's director. And then there are health concerns and circumstances that bring the filming to a halt and insert tension into their budding romance. I enjoyed this black romance. It definitely starts off slow because there's a lot of layering in of background information and setting up of the story. I felt that Cannon as a character, it was a little insta-love for my personal preference. I think that it's because there's a number of, they say that they interacted, but we don't get to see that on page. And also there's a lot of time passing in the first 30 to 40% of this book where it's like, and it's been 6 months and we did not talk about any of that. And so it's like kind of hard to wrap my head around that. However, I did feel that they, within their relationship, had really great communication and chemistry. There were other strong elements to this book. They both, Cannon and Neva, had strong, good, supportive best friends. There is chronic illness throughout this book. It's not really mentioned in the blurb, but Neva has a chronic illness, and I felt like that representation was good, though I cannot speak to that. I don't have a chronic illness personally. And I felt like Cannon's support of Neva while she's going through all of her medical stuff was amazing and well written because, in sickness and in health. I mean, they're not married, but, that's the point. And so, and another strong element that I really liked was that the writing style is lush and immersive, and I really felt that there was a sense of Hollywood glamour. And this is an element that I've noticed for other books that I've read by Kennedy Ryan, and I really jive well with her writing style. I didn't feel that this was a perfect book, though. I not quite 5 stars for me because I was a little annoyed with the level of grudge and bad feelings that was between Neva and her sister. And I felt like the sister needed to freaking apologize. And I don't know if that ever really happened or it was sort of too little too late kind of a situation for me personally. And then also the biopic subject of Desi Blue, who is the character that Neva is playing throughout this movie. There's little insertions of the script throughout the book, and I kind of felt like that plot line got dropped by the end of the book. I felt like there wasn't really good payoff for the movie or for the script or for that character, and I felt a little bit let down by that whole element of her playing Desi Blue. So really great book, slow burn, but has some spice, and I love the communication ultimately between the two characters who we get to see a good chunk of this book where they are in love with each other, and that part was really lovely to read all about, especially in Kennedy Ryan's writing style. So those are my recent reads. I definitely have read a lot more, but since this, just because I plowed through a whole bunch of manga and have just been on a roll here recently. So definitely expect to see another recent reads video coming soon from me. And yes, thank you so much for watching this video. Stay tuned if you want to listen to me dramatically read the review for that nonfiction title that I was talking about. Otherwise, feel free to leave a comment, and thanks for watching so much. Bye. My dramatic reading of Cindy's review on Goodreads of Talking to Strangers. Cindy rated it 1 star. When I started this book, I was convinced that I would at least give it 4 stars. Malcolm Gladwell is a great narrator, and the audiobook is very well produced, including music, voice actors, and excerpts from real interviews and videotapes. He explores interesting topics ranging from myopia, default to truth, and the way we misread others' facial expressions. However, I have huge issues with his limiting takes on rape and police brutality. He takes several big-name cases, Sandra Bland, Brock Turner, Jerry Sandusky, etc., and dilutes them into issues of miscommunication while ignoring large factors like racism, sexism, and power. To frame abusers and their victims as strangers who had misconceptions of each other oversimplifies the tragedies and assumes all parties operated from the same playing field with no ill motives. If the issue was that police do not know how to properly de-escalate situations, we would have universal cases of civilians of all races being murdered, rather than have these deaths be statistically higher for Black people. How is it that Gladwell can elaborate on the police officer being afraid for his life when accosting Sandra Bland due to misreading her social cues, but not go into why these misreadings happen more frequently with Black civilians? Ignoring these racial motivations seems purposely obtuse and takes away the nuances he could have made with his arguments, while veering dangerously close into justifying these crimes. The author would be a lot more credible with his points if he had been more selective with his case studies rather than choosing the most controversial for shock value and contention. Saying Brock Turner had to make sense of a stranger's desires and motivation and calling it a hard task, while spending an entire chapter on drinking culture, is a slap in the face to sexual assault victims. I'm sure there is validity in discussing the different ways people define and understand consent, as well as the effects of how drinking muddles communication. But this is the worst case to pick because Turner never cared to make sense of his victims' desires or motivations in the first place. If Gladwell had done actual research into this, he would have known that this case was never about consent or drinking, it was about power. To attribute rape as a result of muddy communications and from being intoxicated is absolutely false, because people who don't understand social cues are not rapists, nor are alcoholics. It is one thing to take prolific stories and force them to comply to blanket generalizations, but it is absolutely irresponsible to apply pseudoscience upon systemic issues that actively harm women and people of color. These arguments are dangerous, lack nuance, and are an insult to victims. I would not recommend this book to anybody. Well said.